A study was conducted to see if there is a difference between the perceptions of people who work in private sector jobs versus people who work in public sector jobs as to whether or not their education adequately prepared them to be effective in their profession. The results are summarized in the table. We are to test this at a 0.05 level of significance. So we are to test to see if there is a difference between the perceptions. And so what we'll be dealing with then is a difference in proportions. So we're supposed to test as to whether or not there is a difference in the proportion of people in the public sector who think they were adequately prepared versus the people in the private sector who think they were adequately prepared. So what we would want to do is assign one group the number 1. So we'll say one of them is group 1, and we could do that just by saying, well, let's do the private group 1. And this is especially important when we're doing a one-tailed test. Now, this particular problem will be a two-tailed test. But when we're doing a one-tailed test, keeping the direction consistent is very important. So if there is no difference, then when we subtract the population proportions, it would just be 0. There would be no difference. Now, since this is a two-tailed test, a difference would be way over to the right or way over to the left. So this is a two-tailed test. And so alpha at 0.05 will be split out into the two tails. And by now we know how to look up these critical values. These critical values are going to be positive 1.96 and negative 1.96. Now I just wrote some z critical values here, and of course, as with all studies of proportions like this, we have to make sure that all of the conditions are satisfied for using the normal distribution. Now, in order to conduct a hypothesis test about proportions, we have to know what these proportions are. And in order to do that, we must know what the total number of observations in each group was. So we'll need to know N1 and N2. What we have here are the combinations of those two yes and no responses. So when we add them together, we would wind up with the total observations. And so in group 1, we have 1,288. In group 2, we would have 975. Looking again at the problem, the question asks whether or not their education adequately prepared them to be effective. So if their perception is that their education did adequately prepare them, then they would respond yes. So our x values then, x1 would be 812 and x2 would be 723. So what we're going to need at this point is a z-test value. But before we find this z-test value, we're certainly going to need to specify our hypotheses. So our hypotheses then will be P1 minus P2 equal to 0 and P1 minus P2 not equal to 0, since this is a two-tailed test. The TI-84 calculator does an excellent job of doing this very easily. We'll click Stat, and we'll go over to Tests. And what we want is a two-proportion z-test. So that'll be number 6. And what we'll need to tell the calculator is what was the value for x1, n1, x2, and n2. So x1 is 812. And n1 is 1,288. x2 is 723. And n2 is 975. Now we'll want to get the direction of the alternative hypothesis correct, and that will be not equal to. So we'll hit enter, and then we'll hit calculate. And we find a z-value of minus 5.60 when we round to 2 decimal places. So our z-test value is minus 5.60. And then comparing this to our critical values, we can see that we land way down here in this tail. So we are certainly in the rejection region, so our decision will be to reject the null hypothesis. Let's also note that the p-value is given to us in a scientific notation form with an exponent of minus 8. And so what that means then is that we don't even have a value other than 0 all the way out to the 8th decimal place. So this p-value is extremely small and is certainly less than alpha. So either way, whether we use the p-value or the z-test value, our decision is the same to reject the null hypothesis. So our conclusion should be something like sufficient evidence was found at the 0.05 level of significance to conclude that a difference exists between the proportions of people in the public and private sectors who believe that their education adequately prepared them to be effective in their profession.